The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Gaprogman-Taylor, and this is episode 49, Configuration in .NET Core with Steve Collins. In this episode, I interviewed Steve about the way that .NET Core handles configuration files, the many different built-in providers, how you can build your own, how the hierarchy works, and how you no longer have to deal with those dreaded web.config files and the related transforms. Some of you may know Steve from his blog posts over at stevetalkscode.co.uk or his talks on .NET configuration best practices. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So thank you very much, Steve, for taking the time out to come and speak with me about .NET configuration.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate anyone who takes the time to come and talk about anything .NET Core with me, because there's a whole world of .NET Core stuff and there's a lot to learn.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking to people like yourself who are experts in all the different parts of it, about maybe one moving part is just, it makes it easier to sort of take in, I think. And so, yeah, I greatly appreciate you spending part of your Wednesday evening with me talking about this.
No problem.
So I was wondering, for some of the folks who may not know much about who you are and the work you do, could you give us a brief introduction?
Okay. I'm Steve Collins. I'm a contract developer architect. I've been building stuff with Microsoft technologies for, the last 25 years or so, starting with VB3 and Access 2 and a bit of SQL Server 4.2. Been contracting for the last 12 years, and recently I've been giving talks at DDD events around the country about configuration.
Awesome. Okay. So you're going to teach us everything there is to know about configuration in .NET today then?
I'll try. I can't promise, but I'll try.
Excellent. Okay. Well, no, that's good. I've always thought that so I have a bit of a background in teaching, and the best way to explain something to someone else, the best way to learn something and to keep it sort of in your head and put it into long-term storage is to sort of explain it to someone else. And so yeah. I think obviously you must know your stuff. Otherwise, you're maybe standing up there blagging your way through. No, I don't think you're blagging your way through it.
It feels like it sometimes.
Well, I mean, those are your words, not mine. So. .NET Core, let's say I create a web application. Maybe I'm using the command line, maybe I'm using Visual Studio, maybe I'm using Rider, something else. I'm using something somewhere, and I've gone file new or whatever it is. And I've created a brand new ASP.NET Core, say, web application. I know that there is an app settings.json and an app settings development.json. And when I go poking around in there, there's some stuff to do with logging and maybe a connection string if I'm lucky. Is that what configuration is? Is that where I need to store all my stuff?
That's your starting point, but configuration is way more than that. When you create a new project, by default, you get the app settings.json and app settings development.json. So the way app settings works in .NET Core is it takes a layered approach. So what it'll do is, if you're in .NET 2.1.2.2, you'll get a default web host builder. And what that will do for you is it automatically knows the order of configuration files to look at. So what it'll do is it will start with your app settings.json and pick up anything from there. Then it'll go to app settings development.json if you're in your dev environment. What it'll do is it'll look at your environment and either pick up app settings development or app settings staging or app settings production, if you've got one of those in there as well. But it goes beyond just the JSON files. What you also have is, if you're using the default web host builder, it'll also pick up settings from your environmental variables, and also if you pass any command line arguments to it. So that's what you get out the box. We'll talk in a minute about user secrets as well. That's another thing that helps you keep your secret configurations out of source control.
Okay, excellent. So there's a lot to unpack there, but there's something you said there about your environment. So I know through my own experience of playing around with .NET Core and the .NET tooling is that if I'm inside of Visual Studio and I hit F5, and if I'm in the CLI and I type in .NET Run, I get two slightly different environments. I know that the .NET Run command will run because if you actually run it, you'll see something pop up saying, running in production. Yeah. Whereas if I run inside of Visual Studio, that runs in development, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's all down to an environmental variable. So if you hit F5 in Visual Studio, if you look in your project settings, there's environmental variable set there where you can say whether you're running in development, staging, or production.
Right, I see. Okay. I mean, that makes sense because if you're running directly from the command line interface, the CLI itself does not know where it is. It doesn't know whether you're on the server, whether you're on your local machine, whether you're in staging, whether you're on your mate Bob's machine. It doesn't know anything. It just assumes I must be in production because I'm running the app.
Yeah, and that is the default for .NET.
Okay, so if I don't supply the environment variable, it will default to production.
That's right. So I think with the .NET command line, you can supply that variable as part of the command line.
Okay, cool. So if you wanted to run it as a developer version on your machine from the command line, you could just pass something in and it will do it.
Yeah, or you could just set the environmental variable in your command prompt.
I think I've done that before. I think there's something when I was doing it before, it was something like ASP.NET _environment equals, then you pass a string in or something. Yeah. That might be an old version though. I remember that being an issue during one of my live coding streams because I'd misspelt development and because development didn't match any of the known strings that I'd told the app about, it wouldn't work. It just defaulted to production.
Yeah. So it's ASP.NET Core _environment.
There we go then. There's a thing called user secrets, which stops you from adding your secrets, I guess your API keys and your settings into source control.
It doesn't stop you per se. If you go and drop into your app settings JSON or your app settings development and type them in there, in they'll go and they'll get committed with your source control. But that's a big no-no. You really don't want to be doing that. The way I look at it is, what if your company is like Microsoft, where everything is closed source, but then all of a sudden someone high up goes, we're going to go open source. And if your connection strings, your API keys are all in source control, they're going to get exposed.
That's true, yeah. I wouldn't want to be working on something and then suddenly, there's my connection string from my production database or my API keys or something.
Yeah. So to get around that, instead of committing to source control, when you create an ASP.NET or any .NET Core project, what you can do is you can right-click on the application project in Visual Studio and say manage user secrets. What that does behind the scenes is it adds an entry into your CSproj file, which is a GUID. What you can then do, once it's done that and you say manage user secrets, it opens up a JSON file and that lives in your user profile. Now, the location is slightly different depending on whether you're on Windows, Linux or Mac. But the core thing is that it's part of your profile. So unless your machine is open to everyone, only you should be able to see the values in that user secrets JSON file.
Right, I see. Because it's in your profile
Because it's in your profile. So unless someone's got in and granted administrative rights to everyone so that everyone can go into each other's user profiles, only you should be able to see it.
Okay. I did attempt to write an article back in, I think, 2017, 2018 about user secrets. And to sort of drive home the point, I put a link to, if you go to GitHub and you type into the search box, remove API key, you can see, I've just done it now, I can see 4,003 commits across the entirety of GitHub where people are removing API keys. Now, obviously, that's a problem, I guess, that the user secrets is attempting to fix.
It is, yeah. Because it's not just about open source projects. Within your closed source, what you may have is you may have certain keys that are only for production, some keys for staging, some keys for development. if you're in a coding shop where certain people are only allowed to see certain keys, if they're all in source control in the various versions of JSON files, well, anyone who's got access to your source control will be able to see them and potentially use them when they shouldn't be able to use them.
Exactly, right? So you may have, say, an API key for, just going to pull something out there, say you're integrating with MailChimp. You may have a developer API key which doesn't actually send the messages out, but if you post something with that API key to MailChimp, it may say, yes, I've successfully sent that because this is a test endpoint. Yeah. Whereas if you've got a live endpoint, a production API key that will actually send the data out, and you have someone in development or test who sends an email out to that endpoint with the production API key, but it is clearly a test email. Let's say, I'm not going to say that I've done this, but someone somewhere will have sent some stupid message as a test, say, maybe this is test email test face or something like that. That could potentially harm your brand. Yeah? It
could, yes. And what's interesting is that if you've got GitHub, that GitHub will warn you if it thinks you've got some secrets within your repository.
Oh, that's really useful. I did not know that. I know there's a lot that GitHub does behind the scenes. I know that there's a few repos that I have that are on .NET Core 2.1, for instance. And every time I go in to have a look and check on the issues and things, I get a little banner, I guess, that says this is on an old version of unsupported version of .NET Core, which is incredibly useful. But I just don't have the time to upgrade it. I like that these sort of open source. Well, I guess GitHub isn't open source, but these open-ish tools are doing that for you. That's really useful. So we talked a little bit about user secrets, and we've said that user secrets are kind of your secrets, like connection strings, API keys, things like that are meant to be kept, well, secret. I mean, they wouldn't be called that if they weren't secrets. So we're saying that if I create a project and I do whatever it is I need to do to enable user secrets, and I add a user secret, that's stored in my profile somewhere out there. Do I have to worry about where it is? Or
not really, because if you're using, say, Visual Studio and you click on Manage User Secrets, it just opens the JSON file up within Visual Studio. If I'm just having a look at mine to see if I can open the containing folder. So on mine, profiles, app data, roaming, Microsoft user secrets, and then the GUID from the CS Proj file.
You can track it down if you need to find it.
Yeah, so if you prefer something like Notepad++ to edit your JSON, you can open it up in something like that. What you can also do is, at a command line level, with the .NET command line, you can use a command to edit your user secrets in there. I think it's something like a set command, where you can set it just part of sort of the .NET command.
Okay, that's useful then. So then that exists on my machine for my profile. So if someone else, like you say, if someone else accesses my machine, and let's say that in the system admins or whoever have set up the machine, I don't want to say correctly, but with the best security intentions in mind is probably what I'll say.
Yeah.
So that we're sitting at the same machine, I log in, I can't find your user secrets. You log in, you can't find my user secrets.
That's right, yeah.
So let's say I have everything checked into source control. I've got my user secrets separate. What if my computer gets destroyed? Does that mean that I need to recreate my user secrets? Because obviously they're stored separately from source control. But then that makes sense because you want them stored separately.
So in an ideal world, what you do is a company level, or you'd also have those secrets stored in something like 1Pass or something, or if you're a corporation, you'd have some digital vault where you've got those stored away anyway.
Sure. So the point I'm getting at is obviously that user secrets isn't the be-all, end-all answer to keeping everything separate. You still have to sort of manually manage those.
Yeah. And also, of course, that's only while you're in development. When you get towards deploying it, you haven't got the concept of the user secrets.
Right, yes. That's a really good point, because whilst the app will probably be running with a user profile system or something like that, it won't have a user secrets area in its profile area in its home directory, I guess.
No, so I think I'm right in saying that within the default web host builder, it only checks that whether you're in the development environment as to whether it pulls in user secrets or not.
Okay, that makes sense because, like I say, even if it wasn't, it would be wasting time trying to look for user secrets.
Yeah.
It's not possible to have them.
Yeah, so then you have to think about, well, where are you going to store your secrets?
That's true, yeah. So, like, let's jump straight past staging or UAT or whatever, straight to production. I have my app running on a production server. I have a bunch of configuration in my app settings, JSON files. I'll come on to that in a moment because I've got a question about those. Let's say I'm running on Azure. Can I add those secrets in Azure outside of source control? Or do I have to store them in a key vault or something?
So you've got two choices in Azure. So Azure has a console where you can store your user secrets. And then what it does is when it's running, it actually puts those in as environmental variables for you. So your application is none the wiser because one of the last entry points is environmental variables and command line. So it'll just pick them up from the environmental variables. Alternatively, if you're running in Azure, well, even if you're not running in Azure, there's also the Azure Key Vault that you just touched on. So that gives you hardware or software encryption, depending on how many bucks you want to pay for it. And that then gives you a proper encrypted store. And it's completely encrypted until you pull it down into your application. For that, you actually have to specifically say that you're using Azure Key Vault. So it becomes one of your application configuration sources. And so you have an extension method. So you'll have to bring in a NuGet package to use that. Not only Azure, AWS have a similar offering, and HashiCorp have a Key Vault as well. But the NuGet package for that isn't an official one. There's just 2 or 3 sort of open source ones out there on GitHub.
That's good to know that I don't have to go with Azure if I want to keep everything secret. What you're saying is I need to have some configuration for my app to be able to pull the configuration from a key vault. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is where it gets fun and games, because to access the key vault, you need to have a client ID and a client secret. So where do you store those? So all you've done is you move the problem down the road a little bit. So then what you need to think about is how you handle that client ID and client secret. So that could be an environmental variable. So again, you've sort of kept it out of source control. You could have an app settings JSON that sits outside of source control and gets deployed to a different directory. So you can use a different file provider and say, I'm going to grab an app settings JSON file from outside the application directory. The problem with that, of course, is if anyone gets access to your production server's file system, your client ID and secret are still exposed. Mm-hmm. So that's when maybe you need to think about having some sort of encryption going on as well.
But then I suppose where do you store the encryption decryption keys?
Exactly. And this is turtles on turtles. At what point do you stop?
Yeah, I guess, though, that there'll be probably some enterprisey level thing somewhere that handles all of this. Somebody's probably thought about this in as a package or something for enterprisey stuff.
And one other option is if you've got certificates available to you, I think I'm right in saying you can register a certificate with the Azure Key Vault, and it will take that certificate as an authentication to go and pull out your values.
So there's loads of different ways to do it. You're not really stuck with just one. Well, let's say I'm a web developer. I like JSON, but I don't like it that much. Do I have to use application JSON? Is there...
No. Out the box, there is support for XML files, but they're not the dreaded web config files. These are just simply XML serializations of your configuration in the same way that the app settings JSON is a serialization of some settings. So we're not going back into the dark, murky world of web config ever again. But even more of a throwback, there's support for INI files.
Oh, wow.
Which took me by surprise back to the days of Windows 3.1.
Yeah. Wow. I remember opening up INI files, INI files for many of the games that I used to play and go, oh, I wonder what happens if I change this value. And suddenly I have, unlimited money or whatever. Yeah,
but what is strange is in Windows 10 is if you go and hunt in the Windows directory for star.ini, you will still find a load of INI files. I don't know whether they're actually used or not, but there are some ini files still in Windows 10.
Oh, well, I mean, I suppose you've got to put config somewhere.
Yeah. But in addition to file-based ones, you can write your own. So everything centers around two interfaces in .NET Core. There's the iConfiguration source and iConfiguration provider. Mm-hmm. So iConfiguration source, you can write your own implementations that go and pull in values from wherever you want. So certainly there's demos out there on the internet, and I've seen YouTube videos of people using things like SQL Server. I think Andrew Locke has got one that uses YAML files. And I've been to a talk where someone was talking about using GraphQL to supply the configuration. So you can use any data source you want if you're happy to go and write your own iConfiguration source implementation. The thing to do then is there's a build method on the iConfiguration source that generates an iConfiguration provider. And that's the bit that takes your configuration source and generates key value pairs. And that's the thing that iConfiguration is interested in, because everything boils down to that. The key in that situation is actually represents a hierarchy. So say you've got a JSON file that's got a top level of A, then B, then C, then D. That is represented in the key with A:, B:, C:, D. Mm-hmm. And that's how the hierarchy is represented. With environmental variables, you've got a similar thing, and you'll see underscores to represent hierarchy breaks.
So I can have JSON files, ini files, YAML files, Dave files, some sort of server of some kind serving it all up. I wonder whether, and if you wanted to really do this, I don't think it's worth doing because it's not very secure, configuration over HTTP or gRPC indeed.
Indeed. I mean, it's something I've sort of seen someone talking about was using gRPC to serve it up. Because if you do that over HTTPS, then I don't see a particular problem with that. But one of the things to think about is if you've got a custom configuration source, how secure is that back end? So we've talked about JSON files being innately insecure because they're on a file system, could get checked in. If you've got, say, a SQL Server database, how locked down is that SQL Server database? Because if anyone in your company can go and see the values in that database, you're back to square one. Now, one of the things I talk about in my talk is actually encrypting values within your configuration. So sort of a double layer of security. So to be able to implement that, you've got two choices. You could either write an iConfiguration source that decrypts stuff on its way out, or, and the method I sort of advocate in my talks, is to write a bridge class. So for those not familiar with the term of bridge class is a way of intercepting data on the way through. So say you've got a basic class of car, then you might have a bridge class that's called supercar. And that bridge class can do some enhancements and change values on the way out between your caller and the underlying car.
You had implementation of your class car and it represented a Mini. You could then access it via the superclass and it somehow becomes a Tesla.
Could do, yeah. But the reason I sort of advocate that is that if you've bound your configuration to a class using the options, which we can talk about in a minute, then you'll have the encrypted value in the bound class. And then what you can do is unwrap that class using a bridge class, which will do the decryption for you.
Okay, so you're saying to the bridge class, go get me the value for my API key for, say, Twitter. And if you access it directly through your options class or whatever that has that raw encrypted version, you're just going to get a bunch of gobbledygook you can't do anything with.
Yeah.
Whereas when you go through your bridge class, you will say, go get me the thing. The bridge class talks to your options class, pulls that value in, decrypts it, and sends you the actual API key back.
Yeah.
Because then, there's only one path to get a valid value for your settings.
Yeah. So then what you can do is in your dependency injection registration with the container, what you can do is if you implement it as an interface, you can use your bridge class to unwrap the I options and expose it as my settings, for example. And that way, when you've got a constructor that requires those settings, you don't even need to worry about I options anymore. You just ask for an implementation of your interface, my super settings or something like that. So that way, if you've got libraries that rely on your settings, you don't have to drag along the NuGet package for I options along for the ride.
That makes a lot of sense because I've seen that before. So one of the things I've seen before is the I options or the I configuration class dependency injected all the way down. So I've maybe got a controller that takes in I options or I configuration because it needs it some value. And then you call an action on that controller and it reads the value from the configuration, or maybe it just passes that straight down to, not a great design, but maybe it passes the configuration down to the service, which then passes it down to some other method because it needs a connection string somewhere, which is not good.
No. So one of the other things I advocate is if you extract interfaces out of your classes that you used in I options, that way it gives you two things. It means you're only passing the implementation of that interface down, which may be your bridge class, but also in terms of things like your controllers or libraries that require on that, you only have to mock that interface. So you don't have to get involved in configuration at all whilst you're doing your unit tests, because you can have a controller that says SQL connection string with just one property of SQL connection string. And you just mock that one property on that interface instead of having to mock I options of my settings, something like that.
Sure, that makes sense. Like you say, it makes it easier for mocking, which means unit tests, integration tests, end-to-end tests become less of a pain because you don't have to supply the actual value. You just supply an interface which will return any string or return a known string or something.
Yeah.
So we've talked about it a little bit there anyway. So you can represent some form of object, I guess, inside of your app settings.json, and you can read that out as strongly typed.
Yeah. When you're doing your dependency injection registrations, there's an extension method called configure, and that's a generic. So what you can say is you can say configure angle brackets my settings, and then say get section my settings bit from within the JSON. And what it will do, as long as the configuration marries up to the layout of your class, it will go and bind it for you. The downside to that is it exposes it through the I options interface and not directly. This is how I came about doing my journey into configuration to start with, because I wanted to do a bound class and I did the configure. And in my controller, I made a request for my settings and I was kept getting null. And then I had to go back and read the documentation, something developers hate doing. But then the penny dropped that what I actually had to do was either consume I options of my settings, or I options snapshot of my settings, or I options monitor of my settings. So those are the three interfaces that get registered when you do a configure T in the dependency injection container.
Let's say you're not bothered about having to expose it through I options of type T, for instance. Mm-hmm. You could pull that out as actually a POCO, a C# class.
Yeah. So what you could do is within your dependency injection, after you've registered the configuration, so configure T, so there's two ways you can deal with that. You can either use a Lambda expression, which will go and unwrap the I options. So, for example, you've got configure T, which will give you I options of my settings. You can then register a transient of my settings and use a Lambda that says get required service I options my settings dot value. And that'll do the unwrapping of your POCO out of the options and can serve it up just as my settings. So that's one way of giving you your POCO. The other way, by using the bridge class, is to take the I options my settings in the constructor of your bridge class and register your bridge class as a transient. So that way, when you make a call for your bridge class, my settings bridge, it will automatically get the I options injected into it. And in the constructor of your bridge class, you go and unwrap the value from the I options. So with that way, you only ever have to take in your POCO into a constructor. I then prefer to then have an extracted interface, which comes back to the whole mocking principle.
If you can mock what the POCO is going to look like, and you're handling all of that dependency injection for your real instance, you can then mock that interface and say, when I say, get me the connection string, just return this value, or just return a known string, or return any string. It doesn't really matter because it's a mocked version.
Yeah, it's a mock, yeah.
Okay, so we touched on it really early on, and you said that there was a hierarchy. Looking at the code that I've got in front of me, I've got an app settings.json and an app settings.development.json, and you said that you can have a staging and a production. And when I start my app, it figures out through whatever magic it uses, the environment tag, or maybe something like that. It figures out where I am, which environment I'm in. Does it load all of the JSON files?
No, behind the scenes, what it does is it uses string interpolation to replace your environment. So it will look for app settings dot curly brace environment, close curly brace. So it uses string interpolation behind the scenes to know which JSON file to load. So what it will do is, say in app settings, you've got a setting called message, and it says, say hello. In app settings development, that will override the basic one. So you might have a value that says goodbye. That might get overridden in your user secrets, and it could get overridden at command line and environment. So each time it goes up the tree, it overrides an underlying value.
So the development one will override any values in the normal one.
Yeah. And then user secrets can override that. What it also does is, as well as overriding, it allows you to append additional sections into your settings. So you might have a very bare skeleton as your basic app settings, but then you might enhance it more with your development one. So you might have some extra stuff to do with logging, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then that might get extended again with your user secrets. So you might put a value in your user secrets that allows you to do some debug analysis in there.
So let's say there's a bunch of common values between all of your environments. You're not having to copy them into your development, your production, your user secrets, your key vault, that kind of thing.
No. So you can think of it very much in the way of class inheritance, in that you might have an abstract base class that's got your basic settings, and then you might inherit off of that and then go and implement some abstract values. So you can keep going. So it keeps going up the tree, either by overriding or by enhancing.
So then if you need some extra configuration for development that isn't required in production, as long as your app can deal with that, then you could just not include it in your production JSON.
Yeah. And if, as part of your web host builder, you've used extension methods to add in custom ones, then those would come in as well.
Okay. Let's say I've got a development environment which is on a server, and that's not very stable at all. I've got a pre-QA environment that is meant to be stable for developers to test in, and then I have a QA environment for the QA to test in. I could create an app settings.preqa.json, tell my web host builder about it, and then it will just know when I start with pre-QA to load this file rather than the development one.
Yeah, so it comes down to the value you put in the ASP.NET Core _environment environmental variable. So if you go to your project properties in Visual Studio in debug, there's a section there for environmental variables where you can go and set it up. I think you can also set it up within the application launch settings JSON file for Visual Studio. And lastly, you could just set it up as an environmental variable if you're using .NET Run.
I think we covered earlier on, when you start something by default without going through Visual Studio, it will default to production because, I mean, the tooling doesn't know where it is, so it's best to assume.
Yeah, it's a safe assumption, yeah.
So we talked about the user secrets, and I can have essentially configuration per user.
Yes.
So I've seen this in the wild. I don't know whether this is something that was missing from the deployment tools that were being used. So to give some background, we were using Azure DevOps to deploy our application out there onto a server. And we'd noticed that even though we were telling it this is going to be production, all of the app settings.json files went with it. Is this required?
It's not required. I think what that comes down to is on those files, whether you say copy always, copy if newer.
So that's not necessarily something in DevOps or your build tools or anything. It's just they're packaged by default. That's just something I think that it's worth knowing about for other developers, that when they ship their application, unless they explicitly set it up, all of their configuration is going to go with it. So potentially your development keys are going to go with it if you store it in your app settings.json. But then if you're keeping everything in user secrets, then maybe that's not too big of an issue.
Yeah. And if you're using a CI/CD pipeline, you could always do something in your CD pipeline to say, go and look at the environment I'm deploying to and go and exclude the other files.
Oh, of course, yeah. See, that was going to be my other question as well, is you hinted earlier on about app settings in .NET Framework, those long may they be forgotten XML files, the files.
Yes.
And how back in the day, if we wanted to change a value in there based on which environment we were deploying to, we had to do an application config transform, which was some, I'll say, not very nice to read XML.
No.
Because we're not doing those transforms anymore. We don't have to do that.
No. So whereas in the web config days, it was a transformation. So it was running effectively an XML transformation over your web config or app config as part of the deployment. Now, because it's a hierarchical thing, you're not actually changing your files. You're just providing extra files or extra other configuration sources and saying A overrides B, overrides C, overrides D over E, etc., etc.
So then, if I was that, I don't want to say masochistic, but if I was that horrible to myself, is it possible to do transformations in your CI/CD? So let's say you're using Azure DevOps. Is it worth going, yes, I want to transform this? Or is it just worth having a separate JSON file and not having to deal with the horror of having to move things around?
There's two approaches you could do. You could do some sort of transformation. And certainly where I'm working at the moment, we use Octopus Deploy. And what we do is in our app settings JSONs and the various environment ones, what we do is we just have a placeholder curly brackets, and the actual secrets and values are in Octopus Deploy. And Octopus Deploy effectively does that transformation for you. And you could do the same with Azure DevOps. So it just does some substitutions for you. But that's not really a transform per se. That's just text substitution. The other way you could do it is if you're deploying to Azure, then we've talked about having the dashboard, because if you're deploying to Azure and you're using the dashboard, the app settings.json doesn't get deployed. What happens is you use the dashboard and that sets everything through environmental variables.
That completely negates the worry of what if my server is compromised.
Yeah.
There are no configuration files, and if someone wants to try and get to your secrets, assuming they don't have access to the dashboard, but they've somehow managed to break into Azure, which is, if someone manages to break into Azure, we've got slightly bigger problems. But let's say they've managed to break into the back end of Azure. They've got onto the server where your application lives. They found the files. There's no app settings.json. They can't get to your database connection strings and your API keys and all that kind of stuff because they literally don't exist.
Well, they do, but they're environmental variables. So if someone knows to go sneaking around at environmental variables, and that's why I advocate encrypting stuff and using a bridge class to decrypt stuff as well. So anything that touches a surface, such as environmental variables, command line parameters, JSON files, if you've encrypted as well, but it comes back to where do you store your decryption keys? At some point, you've got to have something that's in clear text to be able to go through the motions of then decrypting. And that's where certificates can come in useful, because if you've got a certificate-based encryption decryption, there is no passwords to go and look for.
But then presumably you have a certificate somewhere on file or in storage somewhere.
Yeah. Well, certainly on Windows, you've got the certificate store.
Of course.
I can't speak for Linux because I'm not so familiar. But
yeah, of course. There is something similar. I think it's called the key store, which is essentially the same thing. What I'm seeing in my head is that I'm seeing this wonderful Rube Goldberg machine of we'll load a file from storage which has a key in it. We'll decrypt that using another key that we pull from GraphQL, and then we'll pull another thing from SQL Server, combine all three to get the URL to poke to get the settings, go get the settings from there, and then decrypt it with something else.
And meanwhile, your user's disappeared because of the latency.
Of course. That's absolutely it. Oh, dear. Wow, okay.
We've just taken 5 minutes to decrypt this value and my user's disappeared.
That's it, right? Well, yeah, I mean, the system's incredibly secure if no one's using it, right?
The best systems of all are systems with no users.
That's exactly it. Seal it in concrete, dump it in the ocean. There we go. So that's really useful to know, that there is a hierarchy to how the app settings files are loaded. You don't have to use JSON. You can use INI files. You can use XML files. There are people who've written libraries that will let you use YAML files and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of the location of the configuration is almost agnostic, as well as the format.
Yeah, because ultimately it boils down to these key value pairs at iConfiguration provider level, and then that goes into iConfiguration, and at iConfiguration stage, that gets broken down so you can say iConfiguration get section blah, get value. I really wouldn't advocate using the iConfiguration interface raw. The only place I would ever advocate using that is if you've just got a single value that you don't want to bind to a class, you could just pull it out in there and just sort of expose it through some simple interface.
Oh, I see. Okay. So try not to use iConfiguration, try use iOptions instead.
Well, you could use iOptions, or as we were talking about earlier, unwrapping the iOptions and just passing your POCO or interface down the chain. That way, it's taking a lot of the plumbing away from your code. Your code just doesn't care about how it gets some settings. It just says, I've got an interface or a class that's got some settings in. DI will give it to me. And it really doesn't care about the plumbing.
Just to sort of simplify everything. Like you say, when my lamp dies, I don't need to rewire my house to get a new one. I just plug a new one into the wall.
Yeah.
Because the socket on the wall where I plug it into, or indeed the USB port on my computer, has inverted that dependency. I no longer have to wire it up and solder it into my machine. I just plug something in.
Yeah, because if you're passing, say, iConfiguration down all the way through your application has to have knowledge of the layout of your configuration. So say you've got something nested 3 layers deep, you've got to go get section A, get section B, get section C, get value. Whereas if you can just get that bound to a class that's my settings, your application only needs to worry about my settings. And it doesn't care how it got there, whether it was through configuration, whether it was through a mock, whether it's been done through a hard-coded class, for example.
That makes sense. And then good class design steps in and you're able to go, right, this section of the my settings class is only related to database stuff. When I need to pass this to the database, I won't pass the overall class. I'll just pass the my database settings class.
Yeah, so that's where the interface segregation from the solid principles comes in useful, because what you might do is you might have a my settings that implements my database connection plus my logging section, but all you need to do to pass down to your constructor of, say, your controller might be my SQL connection string. And then what you can do is in your DI container, you just say, go and get my settings class, but then also register the various interfaces as well to go and get it out of that settings class. So that way you can get your interface segregation all come back to the settings class. But when it comes to mocking, for example, you've only got to mock that one property on iDatabase connection, which is connection string.
Yeah, rather than having to mock the entire class or the interface which represents the entire class, you're just mocking that one.
The infamous one was, I think it was one of the Microsoft original ones for one of the database interfaces that had about 200 properties and methods that you had to implement.
Wow.
I can't remember whether it was IDB provider, something like that. And it had masses and masses. They hadn't obviously done interface segregation at that point.
Well, I guess at that point, if you're having to crawl that far down into the stack, then you're mocking Microsoft code, framework code, rather than your code.
Yeah.
I think that's been incredibly useful. I now know loads more about configuration and how I should be doing it and stuff. I'll have to look into bridge classes. I hadn't used bridge classes ever in any of my code. I think I'm going to do that now. And I might even write a little terminal app, a console app that I ask for a Mini and it gives me a Tesla just to prove that it works.
You'll have to pay for the charger, though.
Yeah, that's it. A man can dream, right? Okay, so what about keeping up with yourself then? Where can our listeners go to learn a little bit more about you, to read? Do you write blog posts? Do you have YouTube stuff? Do you do talks?
Okay, so I haven't written a blog post for a while, but I wrote a 4-part series about using the bridge class on configuration. That's on stevetalkscode.co.uk. I tweet quite a bit, so I'm at stevetalkscode on Twitter. And I usually sort of bounce around some user groups and DDD conferences around the UK. So I think I've got a few user group talks coming up in the new year in Bristol and Nottingham, I believe.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so if there's people in the UK in those locations, they can maybe come along and see a much more detailed and, I guess, graphically enhanced version of your talk.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll make sure to put links to those things in the show notes. And that way people can sort of keep up with you. And are you open for bookings for Meetup? You said that you travel around a bit for Meetup. So should someone who's running an event want to talk .NET configuration?
Yeah, sure. If they DM me at Steve Talks Code on Twitter, I'm sure we can come to some arrangement.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, all it really remains to say is thank you again, Steve, for taking some time out. Like I said, I really appreciate it. And I know that before we hit record, we had a few technical issues. I know that I've still had some technical issues whilst we've been talking. I've had some Windows nonsense happening, which wiped out my CPU a few times. So, yeah, excellent. Thank you ever so much for spending some time and setting everything up and having a chat with me. It's been really, really interesting.
Thanks, Jamie. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. That was my interview with Steve Collins. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .netcore.show/subscribe for ways to do that, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.